Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner, and today's edition, well, we're getting 10 days up to the Tour de France starting on July 1st, 2023. So I want to cover some more tactics. Last edition of Beyond the Coverage, I showed you guys or spoke about how the tactics for Team Jumbo-Visma and for Team UAE team members, Tadej Pogacar, they're going to mirror each other when the Tour de France starts. The teams are going to look after their race leaders going all the way up into the finish of the hard stages there in Bilbao when we start the first three stages. They're going to look after Tadej Pogacar, Jonas Vingegaard, and they're going to try to deliver their number one ranked rider going into the Tour de France 2023 for a shot at winning and taking some time. Now they're going to race with that same strategy that I talked about before, which is bring your riders into the final climb and deliver them to the finish until we start to see what happens with the chemistry. Is Tadej Pogacar going to be better than Jonas Vingegaard in stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? Or will it be Jonas Vingegaard that's atop of Tadej Pogacar? After we start getting through those first 5 days, 7 days of racing of this year's Tour de France, then the strategies might have to change a little bit. But when I looked at the comments after the last edition of Beyond the Coverage, I saw Dan Groovy, and he asked two questions in there, and one was a very, very sensitive topic. He's talking about Gino Mater and saying he feels guilty about being a fan of a sport that can put young men and young women's lives in danger. Well, you should definitely feel sad about the passing of Gino Mater. He was an amazing personality in cycling. I didn't know him personally, but from my views of watching him, it was absolutely beautiful. All the tactics that he was employing and all the racing and his wins at Tour of Swiss and his loss at the Paris-Nice, they were magical moments that I got to call on. So you feel a little bit sensitive about the matter. And then Dan's asking, well, what about if you're just feeling guilty? Well, Dan, 25 years I raced as a professional cyclist, and never at any point in time in any major accident that I've ever had did I want people to feel guilty. Sad that I wasn't in the race, missing my personality, absolutely, but I never want to feel guilty about enjoying a sport I love. We saw in the last road stage there of Tour of Swiss, stage 7, when it was Nielsen Paulus, the American rider from EF Education, that was the first rider to throw in an aggressive attack and start the racing again at Tour of Swiss after the passing of Gino Mater. And he said afterwards in a beautiful interview, and I agree with Nielsen Paulus 100%, he's doing what he loves to do, and it was about time that he started to feel happy again. You know from the interview of Gino Mater and my own experiences of 25 years of racing bikes that at no point in time do we ever want to see bike racing at the highest level ever disappear. Feeling guilty is 100% normal, Dan, but you should just let it pass, give it some time, let it pass, and enjoy 100% the bike racing that you're about to witness when the Tour de France starts on July 1st. I know that's what I'm going to try to do. Will I feel guilty about it? For certain, but I'll try to push it aside and just fall back in love with the sport that I enjoyed doing so much throughout my whole life. Remember, I'm 51 years old, and for 25 years I raced professional bike racing, so that's a long time. I want to get back to that feeling, just as Nielsen Paulus had talked about after his stage 7 attack, the first attack after Gino Mater's passing. He fell in love with the sport. He's back to doing what he loves. This is what he wants the fans to enjoy, and I agree 100%. Now, Dan Groovy had one other question. He said, when you don't have the horsepower to win, like I talked about on the last edition of Beyond the Coverage, what do you do in the bike race so that you can put yourself into a position to win, or what would your objectives be? Well, there's a tricky question. It's very difficult to explain, and no amount of perfect tactics can have you win if you're the third best rider. If you look at last year's 2022 edition, Geraint Thomas from Team Ineos, he was head and shoulders, I believe, the third best rider at that year's Tour de France. And I talked about it in the build-up on Beyond the Coverage to last year's Tour de France, that if Geraint Thomas wanted to go top 3 podium spot at last year's Tour de France, the only tactic that he can employ that would be the best tactic to use would be to follow Jonas Vingegaard and Tadej Pogacar for as long as he can, stay on their wheel, let those riders do all the work. When you can no longer follow the two best riders in the Tour de France, you drop off and you pace yourself back, and hopefully they play some games. We saw that in last year's Tour de France. If they played games, Geraint Thomas would come back on, reattach, and then most likely Geraint Thomas was dropped before the finish of most of the climbs in last year's Tour de France, but finished solid with a third at last year's Tour de France. He raced it tactically perfect. He followed all the way along, hoping that there would be some kind of mistakes from first and second, Jonas Vingegaard and Tadej Pogacar. Of course, he had a little bit of help with Primoz Roglic getting hurt and injured on stage 5 on the cobblestones and then dropping out in the later stages of the Tour de France, which opened up that podium spot. But when we're talking about Jumbo-Visma, most likely Jonas Vingegaard or Primoz Roglic would have had to sacrifice one of their spots on the top 10 of the general classification if they were going to try to win last year's Tour de France. That's why I always had Geraint Thomas as a real high hope of being able to take a podium place last year. Now, this year's edition, though, it's a bit different, right? Now, I'll go back to a different year, and we'll go back to 2007 when I was riding for Lotto. I did 06 with Lotto, the year Floyd Landis won, and then, of course, was disqualified with the doping positive. But I also did the following year in 2007 when Alberto Contador won. That year, going in with Lotto, we had Cadel Evans, and we knew he was a solid possibility for going podium at the Tour de France, but not very far-fetched would be possible for Cadel Evans to have won that 2007 edition. The only problem was when you looked at it on paper, you had Michael Rasmussen that was on flying form of that year's edition, and then you had Alberto Contador who was climbing magnificently. Cadel Evans, time trials, bit better than the other two riders in front of him, but he doesn't climb as good as Alberto Contador or Michael Rasmussen in that 07 edition of the Tour de France. That kind of tactic you can look at here when you're talking about Dan Groovy's question about saying, well, what can a rider do that doesn't quite have the horsepower? You look that year at Lotto that I was on, and you see that Cadel Evans didn't have any kind of real depth in climbing. Starting the last and final climbs of any of the stages of that year's Tour de France, it was me and Cadel Evans starting the final climb together, and I could only get him about 2, 3, maybe 4, 5K if I was lucky up the final climb, and then he'd be in a selection of about four or five riders, with Cadel Evans doing bulk of the work of covering all the tacks from Michael Rasmussen and Alberto Contador. That year, I always thought Cadel Evans did a bit too much. If he wanted to win the 2007 edition of the Tour de France, when Michael Rasmussen and Alberto Contador were attacking left and right, I think he needed to risk losing the Tour de France and you follow Alberto Contador or you follow Michael Rasmussen and you make them close the gap. That would have neutralized their legs just a little bit, allowed Cadel Evans to come that 0.5% better at that year's edition of the Tour de France to be able to recover on the climbs and then not get attacked. What was happening is Rasmussen would go up the road, Cadel would pull it back, Alberto Contador would go up the road, Cadel would pull it back, Michael Rasmussen would go up the road, and Cadel would pull it back. I thought he just did too much work. He was the favorite for the TTs, but he wasn't the favorite in the mountains. And in my mind, at that 2007 edition, he did too much work. So when you're looking at a question like Dan Groovy, what can a rider do that's third best at Tour de France when two riders are clearly ahead of him in the mountains? You got to tactically take risk. We saw Geraint Thomas did a perfect race to go on the podium. And if he had a little bit of luck, maybe if the other riders have a little bit of bad luck, like Jonas Vingegaard or Tadej Pogacar at last year's edition, maybe Geraint Thomas has put himself in a position that he could have been wearing the race leader's jersey at the Tour de France. That kind of luck normally doesn't happen, Dan. So if you're coming into a Tour de France, you don't have the strongest team, you're not clearly the best rider in the race, all you can hope for is some kind of divine intervention with flat tires at the wrong time, riders getting sick and dropping out, and you're only talking about two riders, a Tadej Pogacar or Jonas Vingegaard, that need to be caught up behind a crash, in a crash, have a flat tire, get sick, get a cold, something like that can happen, and that rider can disappear. And next thing you know, if you race tactically smart and you're the third best rider at the Tour de France, like we saw with Geraint Thomas last year, you might find yourself in the race leader's yellow jersey. What you can't do is start being aggressive and attacking early in the first week of the Tour de France, much like we used to see with Movistar do way back there in 2019, 2018, 17, and about 10 years all the way before that, where Movistar would go into the Tour de France and on the first mountain stage, they would just race crazy aggressive and try to blow the race up. I think if you're third best rider at the Tour de France, and this year it's not super clear who might be the third best rider at the Tour de France like it was last year, when you come in, you have to be patient. You have to be calm. You have to sit back, and you have to hope that maybe you get a scenario like in 2010 where you saw Alberto Contador and Andy Schleck attacking each other left and right. And at times in that year's edition of 2010, I was there, Alberto Contador and Andy Schleck would actually watch each other so much that they would drop behind the front group on the final climbs and then attack back up to us pass us and go up in the front. Now, they were so dominant that they could fully drop back, lose 20, 30 seconds to our group, come back up to our group and drop us. But because both riders, Alberto Contador and Andy Schleck, were pretty even in the climbs, what was happening is they would just neutralize each other out. So if you're the third best climber at this year's Tour de France in the general classification, then you got to hope that first and second, Tadej Pogačar and Jonas Vingegaard, who are clearly on another planet when we're talking about this year's Tour de France edition, you got to hope that somehow they neutralize each other out. They play some tactical games. When you see the tactical game and you're the third best or fourth or fifth best at this year's Tour de France, once you see those tactical games being played, if you can get a gap, you got to take advantage of that gap, and you have to go up the road and hope they continue to play tactics back there and hesitate, and you can gain some time. That could possibly get you into the race leader's yellow jersey early in this week of the 2023 Tour de France edition if they're hesitating back there and they play tactical games and you still are pretty close to their form at this year's Tour de France. So look for a rider like Jai Hindley that has to be patient. We know Egan Bernal, we haven't seen him with fantastic form, but in the past, we have seen him win the Tour de France in 2019. We've seen him win the Giro d'Italia. So if his form has come up from the last races and he can find that brilliant form that's won him 2 Tour de France, 2 Grand Tours in the past, then we could see a rider like Egan Bernal, who's off on the radar, but his form's come up and nobody knows it. If we see tactics back there, Egan Bernal could possibly jump away and get himself in the race leader's jersey. Now, it's really rare at the Tour de France to see somebody that's not the hands-down, outright best rider at the Tour de France win. We've seen it a few times when you look at the past results, where the year with Carlos Sastre won, when there was games being played from Cadel Evans and, of course, the Schleck brothers, and that allowed Carlos Sastre to go up the road and win. He was probably third, maybe fourth best rider overall at that year's Tour de France, but was still able, because of the tactics being played back there, and because the Schleck brothers are on his team, they allowed him to go up the road. That puts pressure on Cadel Evans. He doesn't want to pull the Schleck brothers all the way up the final climb. Carlos Sastre gains some extra time, throws in a magnificent individual time trial performance late at that year's Tour de France to hold on and win the general classification. That is the only tactic that you can play if you're not hands down the best rider and you don't have the horsepower or the team behind to pull some magical tactics out of the book. You have to be patient. You have to wait for the window to open up, the window of opportunity. And when it opens up, you got to know it, see it right away, and be ready to go and attack at that moment. Otherwise, you never attack until you see that final little hesitation from the 2 best riders in the Tour de France. Play with each other tactically. Once that window opens up, you got to go, and that's how you win the Tour de France. Now, I want to bring up just a couple other little tactical games that I saw at this year's Tour of Swiss from Skilmos. Matheus Skilmos, Trek Segafredo, he won this year's Tour of Swiss edition. And I want to show you about stage 3, how intelligent Skilmos raced. Doesn't come in with Trek Segafredo with any kind of a dominant climbing team at this year's Tour of Swiss. Yet he was smart and intelligent to let Remco Evenepoel and Soudal Quickstep do the work on the first mountain stage of this year's Tour of Swiss. Followed Remco Evenepoel, stayed on his wheel for a few kilometers. Once Remco Evenepoel slowed, he saw the attack from Felix Gall. Remco Evenepoel couldn't cover it. At that moment, Skilmos knows that he could possibly take the race leader's jersey, so he attacks, bridges across to Felix Gall up there, and then wins that stage and puts himself in the race leader's jersey. Now, this was a tricky situation for Skilmos. Trek Segafredo, like I said, did not have a dominant team at the Tour of Swiss that can get him deep up into the climbs. So when we start looking at stage 4, Skilmos had to be incredibly tactically aware of his scenario of what's going on. When we get into the last climb of stage 4, Skilmos, while wearing the race leader's jersey, is never seen on the front. Not like the day before where you saw Remco Evenepoel, who had started the 2023 Tour of Swiss with underform, where he goes full gas at the bottom of that climb trying to destroy everyone without 100% form. Skilmos knows that Remco Evenepoel's form could come up, and he also knows that he's not the outright best rider in the world where he can just drop everyone, put 30 seconds into him instantly, and keep that gap all the way to the finish of the climb. So what does he do? He plays the tactical game. When they started the last climb on stage 5, he followed behind everyone magnificently. Skilmos was beautiful on stage 5 with his tactics. How the other riders let him get away with doing it, not so beautiful, but himself, absolutely magnificent tactics, using his Trek Segafredo team to keep everything together as we started the last climb. And then he just followed wheels the whole time. Even Felix Gall, when he went up and got about a minute and 15, minute and 20-second gap on all the GC favorites back there and was putting himself into the race leader's yellow jersey, every time I'm watching the cameras and they're on that chase group of GC favorites behind, Skillmost is always following the wheels of all the GC favorites back there, and they pulled him all the way up to the finish to be able to just lose a few seconds to the general classification and stage winner of Felix Gall up the road. Now we get into the last mountain stage, stage 5, and he did the same thing. They started the last climb. Soudal Quickstep did a lot of pulling on the final climb, mountain stage, stage 5 of this year's Tour de Suisse, and that allowed Skillmost the whole time to be following behind. Little bit of work on the front from Skillmost certainly was employed throughout the final climb, but not much. Never believing that he can just drop everyone there at the Tour of Suisse, doing the minimum amount of work and forcing the other riders. It's a tactic that I love to watch at this year's Tour of Suisse, where Skillmost was beautiful in dictating that he was not going to pull on the front the whole time, going halfway up the first part of the climb just to get attacked like Remco Evenepoel did on stage 3 of this year's Tour of Suisse. Instead, he just said, hey, you guys got to do it. I'm going to cover moves. I'm going to sit back there, and they pulled him all the way to the finish. So without a super strong team, and without being an outright 2 levels above everyone at the Tour of Suisse, Skillmost was still able to win the general classification with a brilliant individual time trial on the last stage that locked him up. And now we'll bring him into this year's Tour de France as one of the favorites to go top 10 when the race is all said and done at this year's edition of the Tour de France. Now, if you get into other kind of tactics other than that, when you're talking about top 3, there's tactics amongst all the other teams. They're racing for stages. They're racing for the KOM jersey. They're racing for the sprint jerseys. And of course, they're even racing for something as simple as the most combative throughout the stages. But if you're not the 3rd, 4th, 5th best rider at the Tour de France, the only other hope tactically you can employ at this year's 2023 edition is go long in one of the breakaways, and again, hope UAE Team Emirates and Jumbo-Visma hesitate back there and allow a rider who's not a threat on the general classification, but could solidly be a top 10 rider at the end of the Tour de France to get in one of those breaks and take the race leader's jersey. We saw that, for example, at the year when we're talking about Thomas Voeckler riding for AG2R when he put himself in the race leader's jersey and was holding the race leader's jersey at the Tour de France in 2011 for one very long period of time. So that is also a tactic you can employ if you're far outside of the top 3, top 5 best at the Tour de France. You could have that ability to jump away in an early break and possibly get yourself into the race leader's jersey at the Tour de France. And if it's all done right, we've seen it with Oscar Pereiro at the 2006 edition of the Tour de France when it took Floyd Landis many stages to be able to come back and take that race leader's jersey away from the Spaniard, who of course later ended up winning that year's edition of the Tour de France. That's my take up here on the Beyond the Coverage. Hope you guys like the tactics. Look for them at this year's Tour de France. Certainly UAE Team Emirates will do the first and most easiest tactic, but all the other teams, when you're talking about trying to get into the top 5 of the general classification, they got to either go big or stay patient and look for the window of opportunity, and it's always going to come if Jumbo-Visma and UAE Team Emirates hesitate and really spend a lot of time looking at each other. That's how you get yourself in the race leader's jersey at this year's edition of the Tour de France. Like and subscribe. I'll be covering all the teams that are listed up there in Pro Cycling Stats to start this year's 2023 Tour de France soon in the coming days, so we can dissect tactics of what each team could best expect to get out of this year's 2023 edition of the Tour de France. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys real soon.